Hello and welcome to Dateline London. This week, Donald Trump's travels abroad and trouble at home. Can one escape the other? And now Britain's political parties have published their manifestos, their contract with the people. If we vote for one of them, just what are we signing up to? With me, David Aronovich of The Times, Annalisa Piras, the Italian writer and filmmaker, Nabila Ramdani, the Algerian journalist, and Stryker Maguire, London editor for Bloomberg Markets. Warm welcome to all of you. It's good to have you with us. Let's begin with Donald Trump, because he may have been on board Air Force One Friday night, en route to Saudi Arabia, but his team was still trying to firefight the latest twist in the sacking of the FBI director and the Russia connection, if there is one. I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job, the New York Times claims, he told the Russian foreign minister. I faced great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. Well, if he did say it, that last part looks very premature. John McCain, the veteran Republican senator, is among many to observe that this all feels horribly familiar. Stryker Maguire, they are, of course, all thinking of Watergate. You were in the States working as a journalist back then, all those years ago. Do you have a sense of deja vu?
I was a mere child, yes.
Precocious journalistic talent.
Journalists started at a very young age back then. So is it like Watergate? No and yes. I mean, it's one thing is that, remember, Watergate began with two break-ins, and May and June 1972. It built rather slowly. The break-ins themselves were almost inconsequential, the cover-up. We all know that that was what did it. So 2 years and 4 months later, Nixon resigns. In this case, it starts out much bigger. The germ of all of this is the possibility of Russian interference in the U.S. electoral process. So that's where you begin. You begin at quite a high, serious level about protecting your national electoral integrity. Then you have all of these revelations while Trump is in the White House. One thing about, that quote that you just gave,
yeah.
That actually that's in a White House document, and the White House has said that it's authentic. So there's no question about what he said.
Right.
What he said. But what's interesting here, I think, is the sourcing of all of this stuff. It's coming from officials in and out of government. Most of them still, serving officials. And that, I think, is super important, because it tells you that there are people who are really worried about the conduct of the presidency and the way, not just what Trump does, but why he does it and how he does it. He seems totally unable to separate anything that happens from himself. It's all about him. So in the midst of all of these revelations last week, we have Trump going to give a commencement address at a university, where we all know what happens at commencement addresses, right? You talk to the young people, you talk about their lives ahead, et cetera, et cetera. No, he talks about himself and talks about how he is the most vilified, hounded president in the history of the United States. Politician.
In the history of the world.
No politician has been treated worse or more unfairly, he told the Coast Guard Academy. David, Stryker's saying there that a lot of this stuff is actually, this poisonous drip of stories is coming from within government. I mean, in a sense, some of these officials are behaving worse than the president, aren't they?
No, of course they're not.
Why not? Don't they have
no, of course they're not. It's their
job. Don't they have a duty of allegiance to the President of the United States, the holder of the office?
I think they, also presumably, they have some duty and obligation towards the people of the United States. I mean, we have a difficulty. The very fact that you used the term alleged earlier when it's not alleged, it's actually true, shows you the problem that we're having with this. Essentially, we all know it, you have a man who is not fit to be President of the United States or fit to be the President of a leader of a large democracy who was nevertheless elected. Almost everything he does shows that he's not actually temperamental. To call the previous director of the FBI, the man who's just gone out, who's about, incidentally, probably to testify before House committees, a nut job, and to do that to a major senior Russian intelligence agent, you don't actually have the words to describe it. Now, for a while, the White House officials or other kind of officials sucked it up. People gave him a couple of months to see what he would do and how he would react. We created this kind of potential narrative, BBC and other people did. Of course we did. He might be all right. He might be captured by the system. He might somehow or other be modified by it. It would kind of close in around him. There were actually good things about the way. We've all been at this, and it's all nonsense because actually the man is ignorant, he's not interested, he's completely incurious. And I'm not saying these things as insult, I say these simply as observations. When he said to Comey, as he certainly did, lay off old Flynn, will you? It wasn't just wrong to do it, it was also profoundly ignorant because he had no idea of how the FBI actually worked and he hadn't been interested enough to find out. The thing about Donald Trump is, and we'll find this, we'll talk about this about in an international context, is there's no way you can get in. He is full inside his skin. He is so full within that carapace of Donald Trump, there is no room for anything from the outside to get in.
The only thing about people on the outside is loyalty. So take Mike Flynn. Even after Trump fired Mike Flynn, he continued in private to defend him. That's because he had this feeling that Mike Flynn was on his side.
Nabila.
Well, I think, there are certainly, you were asking about similarities with the Watergate. I think there are certainly echoes of Watergate in the sense that we're talking about allegations of immense corruption at the heart of the American government. But I suppose it is worth remembering that Nixon resigned by his own accord and he was not successfully impeached, and that will give Trump an awful lot of confidence. Having said that, in general, I think there has been so much incredible hyperbole about the whole Donald Trump story that almost from day one, he's been one of those stories that people expect will end in a cataclysmic way at almost all the time. But he seems to be able to ride, the most scandalous of allegations and indeed accusations, and he keeps on going. And it has to be said that there's the witch hunt terminology that he uses reflects so much of his, of his own typical language. I think the question is whether his opponents and indeed those investigating him will be able to sustain, the assault on him so as to try to get him out. And I would contend that it will be very difficult indeed. And in the end, an alt-right populist politician like him thrives on scandal.
And Annalisa, if he is a politician who has been, spent really the last couple of years through his campaign and through becoming president, turning a lot of the negatives into positives for him, do you think he can carry on doing that?
No, I don't think so. So I think that is just a matter of time, because at the end of the day, what is at stake here is the check and balances of the American system. So all the evidence points to the fact that this needs now to take a certain course, and the only obstacle to it is the electoral kind of power of as a deterrent for the Republicans in Congress.
Having said that, it's worth noting that investigations into highly classified subjects like that take an awful lot of time, and they're unlikely to be resolved, certainly not in the short term. And also bearing in mind that Donald Trump has the look of a one-term president written all over him, I don't think he'll be caring too much.
Well, and that presumably is a problem for the Republican agenda, isn't it? Because this is now overshadowing everything.
What could happen is that there will come a time when what he thinks doesn't matter, that the party will go to him and say, this has to stop. There's not only the special counsel investigation, but there's also in the Senate Intelligence Committee, and in the House Intelligence Committee. So you have 3 investigations that are about to begin. It hasn't even begun yet. And there are midterm elections next year. They're not that far away. That's very, very serious for the party.
But also what can accelerate everything is the economy, because if the economy starts taking a real knock,
And we forget the American economy did rather well under Barack Obama for quite a long period. After that, his initial arrival, the very difficult period, then it started to improve.
Well, then under Trump, there was this weird, almost like the economic equivalent of a fake war period, where there was a so-called Trump trade, and markets were going up. This is largely because people thought they weren't going to be taxed anymore,
or regulated,
or anything else. So, but the Trump trade seems to be over. The dollar has weakened.
It's quite interesting.
We just don't know how exactly.
It seems there's also an awful lot of childish whataboutery in this whole debate, and certainly supporters of Trump, and indeed Trump himself, believe that Hillary Clinton got away with effectively dodgy dealings while she was Secretary of State. So why shouldn't he? And it informs, this primitive debate, and the only losers are really the American people.
You talk about primitive debate. I mean, it's interesting that Lindsey Graham, who is regarded as one of the more erudite senators and often a critic of Donald Trump, observed this week that a lot of us here are quite glad he's leaving for a few days. He may be leaving Washington. They may have got a bit of breathing space.
There was a wonderful photograph taken of Mike Pence on the
Vice President,
Vice President, as it was taken on a long lens. To say his face is inscrutable, it's the nearest thing to a little smile that you've seen Mike Pence give. It's kind of as Donald Trump took off.
Well, he may have taken off, but he's landed as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned.
Yeah, he's landed
this weekend,
in Saudi Arabia.
and he's on the rest of the week, an 8-day tour, his first tour around the world. Nabila, what is important about this tour? What do you think we should be looking out for from this trip?
Well, he's embarked on his first international trip, mainly to the Middle East. He's arrived in Saudi Arabia. He's going to go to Israel and Palestine, and he's clearly made out that he can make some progress with the Israel-Palestine situation, and that has been his claim all along. But we have to note that his most memorable statement very early on was the possibility of moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem. That would have been, an absolute disaster, of course. But he was well thought through as well, and it's typical of, the kind of headline-grabbing, shocking tactics that Trump, in fact, revels in. But he seems to have gone quiet with this idea. But to give him some limited credit, he also, when he first met Netanyahu in the White House, he also asked him to hold on to the building of illegal colonies.
These are the settlement building, which is illegal under international law, has been condemned under international law, and is a huge sticking point in terms of the possibility of resolving this.
In terms of progress, in terms of peace. But let's be honest, this whole trip is about armament. He's going to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and indeed to Israel.
David, do you see any possibility of an opportunity here that, not necessarily created by Trump, it might be an accident of timing, but that somehow there is an opening here? Because we've heard warm words from Mahmoud Abbas. He'll be meeting him again in Bethlehem. We've had relatively positive sounds out of the Israeli Prime Minister as well. Is there an opening here? You're giving me a Mike Pence look.
Yeah, no, without the smile, but with the kind of... What is there about this American president, this administration, or even his senior officials, which would give us any reason to believe that they would have the sophistication and the subtlety to succeed where their predecessors had failed? What is it about the circumstances in the Middle East that would give rise to a belief that there was a significant opportunity being created now that didn't exist in the immediate past? What he's going to talk mostly to the Israelis about is Iran. Because that's actually the principal concern that they have. It's actually, we should note that it's pretty good news that Rouhani is winning the election, looks like winning the election this weekend.
Possibly helped by Washington not reimposing sanctions.
Possibly helped by Washington not reimposing sanctions. But that's the major game. The major game is Syria. I don't imagine that Trump wants to invest more. I mean, who learns very little, as we've talked, wants to invest more than a kind of scintilla of his energy and status in the question of what happens between Israel and the Palestinians.
Openings, I think we've been talking about openings since the late 70s. They just don't, they occur and then the window closes. It just doesn't happen. And as I think as David's making a very good point, first of all, this administration is totally distracted. Secondly, where is this terrific cadre of people that is going to make this happen? Jared Kushner?
The son-in-law, the first son-in-law, I should call him.
Yes. But also, how can you talk about an opening for peace when this man is going to Saudi Arabia to sell weapons? So Saudi Arabia is on an arms race, is the country in the world that is spending more money in proportion of its wealth into weapons. it is antagonizing Iran, and Trump is there to give them more weapons. So I don't know how you can talk about openings, certainly not for peace, in my view.
What about the next stage of his trip? Because he's going to be at the NATO summit in Brussels. He gets to go to Sicily for the G7. He also meets the Pope. I mean, he's going to have some potentially quite interesting conversations, not just with Pope Francis, but also he has a first meeting with Emmanuel Macron, the new president of France, who is old Europe and proud of being old Europe. Indeed, his man who wants to revitalise the EU. It's quite hard to see much kind of meteor minds going on in any of those.
No. I think it's going to be a steep learning curve, even for a man like Trump. I think he's going to learn quite something in meeting the Pope and Macron. I think they're going to tell him that actually the world is not as he sees it. And especially I think what is relevant and important to watch is the 25th of May NATO summit in Brussels, where Trump and his view of the world and NATO is going to have a very kind of wake-up call of what is the reality of NATO and defence in Europe.
We've got this intriguing briefing we've had, David, that apparently the notes for this summit are being designed in such a way that they keep mentioning the president's name to keep him interested, but also they're kind of trying to keep him quite short as well, because he doesn't apparently have a very big attention span.
What are the chances that in 2 months' time he'll be back in the White House and he'll have a delegation from somebody? He said, I met the Pope. He said, I wasn't very impressed with him. There's a really big chance that that's what Trump will do, if that's what he kind of feels about the people. The Pope says, well, actually, we want greater human rights, etc., around the globe and more emphasis on poverty, so maybe your capitalism shouldn't be quite so rapacious. And Donald Trump says, I've really learned a big lesson here, I think I'm going to change significantly my outlook towards it. Or is he going to go around and say the Pope's a nut job?
Well, let's leave that question hanging in the air, and perhaps we'll find out after next weekend. Now, we know just under 3 weeks until polling day, and Britain's major political parties have published their manifestos. The policies are there, but which are the vote winners? I suppose, David, I have to start with you. When you look at these documents, do you feel, I know now where they stand? I've got a really clear idea. When I go into the polling stations, I'll know positively what I'm voting for.
OK, it's very important that we pretend that the manifestos matter, isn't it? This is the game that we absolutely have to play. This is the BBC. I don't know whether actually we're as sold on the rules that the BBC has to abide by as everybody else and so on. But we have to pretend that the manifestos matter.
Except they do matter in very practical terms, because if the House of Lords stands in the way of any legislation the government introduces, it doesn't stand in the way of manifesto commitments.
OK, so it's going to matter to the House of Lords in 3 years' time, but I don't think most people vote on the basis of what they think the House of Lords is going to do in 3 years' time. So, yeah, I mean, actually you could, and also we saw from the national insurance debacle before the election, that actually if you have something which is specifically ruled out by your manifesto, which is a different kind of category of problem, then in that case it's more difficult to enact.
And there are fewer of those things, at least in the Conservative manifesto.
There are fewer of those things.
They've learned to lesson.
So what you have in the Labour manifesto is that you have an incredible wish list of things you're going to spend money on, which someone else is going to pay for, the rich, the companies, etc. And in the Tory manifesto, you have a melange of things that make you look realistic and tough, and also that allow you to suggest that what you're going to do is the thing that you learned from the Brexit vote, which is you're going to take up the left behind and make sure, and somebody pointed out today, and I think it was a good point, that the word protect runs through this manifesto. So that also gives you an idea of the way in which Theresa May thinks of herself. She's kind of the Oliver Cromwell, therefore, the Lord Protector of the British people. And there is actually something vaguely Cromwellian about her.
What about the return of the state striker? Because it's writ large, not just in the Labour manifesto. You might expect it there, not least under a quite old-fashioned sort of view of Labour that Jeremy Corbyn has, or traditional, you might call it. But it's there very strongly in the Conservative manifesto as well.
Well, yes, but I find it hard. I guess maybe like David, I don't believe that this manifesto represents the soul of the Tory party. But what she seems to be doing is she's casting an incredibly wide net. She wants to get the Blair electorate of 1997. She wants to somehow get that same group of people.
That big tent.
Huge tent.
Absolutely.
Huge tent.
Yeah.
And when the Tories were not wiped out, but they were certainly cut back. And what's happening now is that, you know, I almost feel like she could say whatever she wants to say, because I just don't, there's no real opposition. The Labour Party seems to be simply designed as a protest to whoever's in power. They don't seem to have aspirations of power themselves. They seem to be totally content with trying to do whatever they can do to change the agenda a little bit.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Nabila, that, for example, we talked a lot this week about older voters and how in the past there'd been a real desire to embrace older voters, not least because they're the ones most certain to vote. But instead of, you could say that after David Cameron's candy, Theresa May is offering them candour instead. She's saying, no, we won't be able to afford to provide social care. No, we're not going to maintain the commitment on pensions going up 2.5%, at least 2.5% every year. You know, these kinds of things are no longer being given to you. You have to accept that things are going to cost money. I mean, it's a different approach.
Very much so. And I think one thing that certainly people abroad found very odd indeed is that David Cameron rightly resigned after effectively losing the Brexit vote. And his job has been taken over by a Remainer. And that's, you know, the main oddity from people from abroad. And one thing that fascinates me about the general election, more generally speaking, is how pragmatic and non-ideological everyone has to be. Theresa May knows that she has, I mean, the biggest challenge facing Britain at the moment, by far, is Brexit. She has to try to shape Britain to cope with that. And yet, everybody knows that she was a Remainer, and that's why, you know, comparisons with the conviction politician like Margaret Thatcher are so ridiculous. Theresa May is quite happy to U-turn, and there's no Tina as far as
it's very interesting how this fact, which is so obvious for everybody else in Europe, it seems to be completely forgotten in Britain. So the rest of Europe looks with dismay at May because she's seen as a turncoat. She campaigned to remain, and now she presents herself as almost a fanatic hard Brexiter.
And that could be a problem for then after the election, you think, when she comes to negotiate?
Absolutely. And one of the most extraordinary things seen from abroad, from the rest of Europe, is that she's telling the British voters, vote for me so that you will give me a strong hand and this would be good for Britain. Well, actually, the rest of Europe thinks that that would be a catastrophe for Europe because she has been incredibly belligerent and she has irritated everybody. So, I mean, it's the contrary of what she's presenting it to the electorate.
I would slightly disagree with the fact that she presents herself as a hardcore Brexiteer. I think she seems to be proud not to be a radical conservative.
Well, no deal is better than a bad deal. I mean, that's pretty extreme.
What struck me about her manifesto, actually, is that it's mainly made up of worthy intentions. It's more, as David says, a wish list, a pragmatic wish list, rather than definitive policy. For example, a lot of the things she's offered are not costed, for example. And as far as her vision for Britain is concerned, she's quite sensible to say that there's no such thing as Mayism, not only because it sounds too close to Maoism, for a start, but also because it goes against her pragmatic nature. And I think that's, you know, it's fair to say that.
Two things. Firstly, in one sense, she's not like Blair at all, which is that this is a distinctly unmodernising agenda. It's actually, in many ways, looking quite backward-looking and so on. So it fixes into that bit of the British people.
It's not quite John Major or May cycling through.
Yeah, but there's a kind of little bit about that.
Right.
There's a little bit of that. When it comes to Brexit, one of the important things that's in the manifesto is the fact that we're going to pay up. Now, this is a big thing in the Tory party because they don't want to pay up and so on. And this suggests that she is aiming for some kind of trade involvement, significant trade involvement, which as a quid pro quo for making payments and so on. And that suggests that she thinks, by and large, the manifesto is aimed at being able to take on the extreme Brexiteer post-election. Now, Sean, actually, funnily enough, is more of an expert on this than I am. Well, funnily enough, he certainly is, and so on. And you know you can't give your opinion, but you can nod. Sean, is that broadly how you see it?
I'm being Delphic, but I've just had this lovely image of Theresa May after the election clutching the manifesto and hitting recalcitrant Tory MPs over the head and saying, you stood on this.
It doesn't sound unlikely at all, does it?
Doesn't sound unlikely. Talking of hitting over the head, what about her personality? Do you think we're warming to Theresa May now. Do you think this election has helped people to sort of to embrace her a bit as an individual?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I
Give me a
really,
bit more
I
than
really
that.
don't think so. I'm not sure she wants to be embraced and loved.
One show, Striker.
Oh yes.
Went on the one sofa with
This
her
was
husband,
a sort of popular
and then all of a
evening
sudden it's like
programme,
Ed Balls doing Strictly Come Dancing. All of a sudden people say, "Oh, I saw a side to her I never saw before."
Yeah, but what did she say on that? I thought it was just wonderful. She talked about. She was asked about her childhood. She said twice it was stable. I mean,
Well, she had horses.
But it wasn't strong, really.
no, that would not be good. No, you know, she is who she is. I think the risk, although there is no risk because she's going to win the election, her party is going to win the election, but there is a risk when you do things that seem to be hurting pensioners, that seem to be hurting school children by not feeding them.
Oh, this is the end of certain school meals.
Yeah,
for some
then
kids,
you risk, I
kind
think,
of universal school meals.
Absolutely, and so you risk sort of emphasizing the part of your personality that strikes people as cold.
I think the number one thing in Theresa May's favour is that she comes across as reasonable, sensible, and dare I say, extremely careful. She knows that she has an extremely difficult task ahead and potentially very risky indeed. And there's no sense of triumphalism or indeed eminent victory.
Nabila, Annalisa and David and Stryker, thank you all very much as ever. Great to have you with us. I know we're going to be talking about both those subjects again in the course of the next few weeks. Do join us at the same time next week. Thank you all for watching. Goodbye.